Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first session in our Back to Basics series. We're super excited to have you here listening and learning about all things translation mix. I'm joined by two great speakers today who are going to help us understand how you should translate that. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. We should have some time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A function or the chat, and we will get to those time permitting. The second is that we are recording this session. So if you have to step away or want to share with a colleague later, no worries, we will share this out after the event as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists today. Ryan Seuss is the Senior Director of Customer Success here at Smartling. He's been in the customer success function for a long time, talking to customers about their ideal translation mix. So welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Cassie. Great to be here.
And Alex Yanuszewski is our Senior Director of MT and AI Solutions. So he is bringing a unique perspective on AI and MT in the translation mix. So thanks, Alex, for being here as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Nice to be here.
All right, so let's get started at the beginning. Alex, why are we talking about translation mix? What makes this such an important part of translation programs?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So I think if you think about an enterprise, right, an enterprise has lots of different types of content, right? It could range from marketing content to legal content to, for example, software online documentation, right? Technical support materials, right? E-learning materials, just lots and lots of content, right? And if you think of this content and think kind of as a continuum, each piece of content has a different audience that it's intended for. It has a different shelf life, and it has a different quality expectation, right? So that's kind of what brings us to the idea of this translation mix, because we've got different contents, different audiences, right? So think of this matrix where all of these features come into play, right? So for example, if you think of something like a knowledge base article, that's typically meant for somebody who's a more technical user, and this content needs to be actionable, but it doesn't need to be necessarily perfect, right? Now, in contrast, if you think about a very high-end marketing piece that's supposed to elicit emotional engagement, it's supposed to get prospective clients interested in a product, that has to be completely stylistically in line with a company's brand, tone of voice, or terminology, right? So if you think of something like a marketing piece, right? Imagine, for example, you're Microsoft and something seemingly minor like an incorrect capital may tarnish your reputation, right? If I spelled Microsoft and the S in the middle was spelled with a capital, you as a user would say, hey, something is going wrong here. Something wasn't very, very careful, right? Whereas if I did this in a knowledge base article, you might say, well, it looks a little bit odd, but it's okay because I can still understand what's expected of me, right? So the idea of this translation mix is it's going to dictate what technologies and workflows are used. And it's an idea that Ryan and I will expand on a bit more shortly. Right, so essentially, speed, quality, cost, it's all dictated by the translation mix. And essentially, translation is not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, Alex, that's 100% right. You probably saw me nodding along there and smirking a little bit when you were talking about a minor capitalization issue. If you think back to one of the most famous examples of localization gone wrong, I can't help but think about all your base are belong to us, right? The classic video game example where I bet that game studio really wish they had human translators in the mix for that one. But, going back to Cassie's question, why is translation mix important and why are we talking about it today? I think now is a great time to have this conversation because of how the industry is ever evolving. If we sat down 3 years ago, yet alone 4 or 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have as complex of a conversation as Alex and I and Cassie are about to get into. It was pretty simple. You're going to hear me throughout this conversation talk about how we came from a more binary place. I'm simplifying things here, but it was basically, hey, do you want human translation and editing, or do you want machine translation? Now, that conversation has evolved, and I feel like we're going to get into it. So I'll stop there. But the complexity that's been introduced and the improvements that have been made, I started at Smartling 8 years ago, and it is night and day from 8 years ago. So I'm excited to get into it today.
Thanks, Ryan and Alex. So Ryan, we'll go to you on this one to start. As you're speaking to customers about what translation mix is right for them, you kind of mentioned no, not one size fits all. So what are some of the factors that companies should consider when they're evaluating which option to use?
Yeah, I mentioned that binary choice between human translation or machine translation. It's not that simple anymore for an organization. It's not even that simple for content types, right? So there are so many factors that go into this. I'm sure if people are listening to this, tuned in, you're thinking of your number one most important factor, and probably everybody has a different answer to that question. Some examples might be visibility of content. Is this going to be the first impression that a visitor to your website gets of your organization, your brand? It might be like Alex was referring to, hey, is getting an understanding of what we're trying to say good enough for things like technical documentation, where we need them to understand, but all our I's don't have to be dotted, all our T's don't necessarily need to be crossed for every single article, right? So what I like to think about, Alex used the Microsoft example. I like to think of a 100-point scale. Now you have these 100 points. How many are you giving to speed? How many are you giving to quality? How many are you giving to cost? So if you're sitting there, you're going, all 100 points, I don't care, they need to be with speed. You're probably thinking machine translation. Now, if you think about, let's say Nike, right? Using them as an example, one of the most famous taglines in the world. Their tagline, everybody knows, just do it, right? With that 100-point scale, I can guarantee that the localization team at Nike isn't sitting there going, okay, let's give 100 points to speed and let's make it cheap. So let's go MT. They are really, really invested in the quality and the message that their brand exudes in all their global markets. So they're going in the other direction with very intense, more trans creation, as opposed to the standard translation and editing process and the involvement of machine translation. That is an assumption on my end, but just do it is a very easy example of a sentence where things can go wrong pretty quickly. So I like to use it here. Alex, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I wanted to kind of expand a little bit on this idea of quality, right? There's also the idea of quality when we're talking about linguistic assets, right? And that, I think, also helps us drive this translation mix, right? As you said, it's not a binary decision, and what helps us to decide where to go depends on the assets that we have, right? So just to kind of explain a little bit what I mean by that, right? When we're talking about the linguistic assets of our company, we're talking about things like translation memories, glossaries, style guides. We're talking about source content itself, right? How well it's written. All of these things are crucial because they help us decide how, what, and when to translate, right? So just to give a couple of examples, if we're talking about source content, we have tools that we can use to evaluate how complex the source language really is, right? In other words, when you're writing this, what's the reading level of the audience for whom this content is intended? Why is this so important? It's important because it allows us to identify content that may not be fit for purpose and may need to be edited prior to localization, right? Prior to localizing into a bunch of languages, 10, 15 languages, prior to doing these numerous rounds of Q&A from linguistic experts and SMEs and risking potential rework and delays, right? So we can look at a piece of content and say, okay, is this really fit for purpose for doing e-learning versus marketing, right? Another thing that we can do with respect to translation memories and glossaries is we can perform what I would call a health check on them and make sure that they are linguistically harmonized and consistent to each other, right? We can look at a glossary and a TM and say, if I'm translating a particular phrase in the glossary, is that how I see it done in the translation memory, right? And that's important because we can basically head off at the pass any potential issues before kind of this proverbial train leaves the station and it's too late to take action, right? So all of these factors also help us be consultative and decide what content to do at what cost and at what quality, and is all part of the translation mix.
How many localization managers listening to this are just going, I am trying to tell my organization localization starts at the source, right? That's something we hear all the time in our industry for sure.
Great. Well, I know you kind of alluded to this several times, Ryan, about the change that you've witnessed over the last 8 years, and Alex has been in the space for a long time as well, so I'm sure he's witnessed it too. But we used to have two buckets, human and machine translation. So what does that? What do the options look like? What do the menu look like today? How many buckets do we have to choose from?
Yeah, the menu's expanded quite a bit. It's looking like a Cheesecake Factory menu now. So it used to be the human translation. What I would say, like, if I explain the industry to my mother, she would understand. Hey, translation is translator. Translators come in and translate the content. And machine translation, I could go in, plug my content in, and a machine does it. Nowadays, at its simplest level, the way I think about it and the way my team talks with customers about translation mix and translation options, we categorize things into three buckets. So I'll talk about these, and then I'll lean on Alex to talk a little bit more about the strategy here between how to make a decision. But the three buckets we talk about are human in the loop, which is a blend of AI and human workflows, and then machine or AI workflows. So the first one being human, there's a lot under that, right? You're probably saying, "Hey Ryan, you said it got way more complex, but it just went from 2 to 3. What's that about?" Underneath human, there's way more there, right? There is transcreation, there's traditional T&E, there's involving reviewers, there is DTP work, there are workflows galore underneath human. For human in the loop, there are a few different models there. So content running through AI, running through an LLM, running through an MT engine, and then being picked up either by a linguist who's doing a heavy lift or doing a light review, or maybe just doing a proofread to make sure it's coherent, the output is coherent. And then there's machine or AI only workflows, which of course is the removal of any human involvement in that workflow. But like I said, Alex, you mind picking up on some of the strategy behind choosing those workflows and what's going on there?
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to say to me, one thing that's interesting because I'm more on the technology side, is that our platform, because it's a bunch of microservices, right? It's flexible enough to handle not only these three buckets that Ryan described, but all of the variants within these three buckets, right? Because it's not just three, it's really three probably times 4 or times 5, because within them you could have a bunch of different workflows, right? And basically the choice of the translation strategy, who we're going to use at what step of the game, how many people are involved, that's going to dictate what technology is used, right? So if we look, for example, Ryan was alluding to a human, let's say a completely human workflow where there's transcreation. In that workflow, we're going to have less technological automation, right? You're most likely not going to use machine translation. In all likelihood, translation memories also will be less helpful, because when you're talking about transcreation, you're talking about almost like more literary like translation, right? You're creating it from scratch. You're trying to make it very, very emotionally engaging, right? Now, if you look at the opposite side of the spectrum, if it's MT or AI only, to me, what's really interesting from a technological perspective is there is no human in the loop. So in this point, we have to pull out all of the stops that we can from a technology, from an automation standpoint, to get this to be as perfect as possible, right? Because there is no second chance, right? You have to do the utmost to get it right the first time around. And the way we do that, by kind of pulling out all of these stops, are a lot of things related to large language models. So things like using adaptive translation memory via large language models, right? Basically taking your translation memory and improving it a bit more with large language models so we get an even higher fuzzy match. Using trained machine translation engines or fine-tuned large language models for the task of doing machine translation. And then finally doing things like using large language models to insert glossaries in a way that's grammatically correct, especially for languages like German, like Slavic, that have inflection, that have a rich morphology. And then do things like large language models are apt sometimes to hallucinate, right? I kind of liken them to a really, really precocious child who can sometimes do absolutely silly things. So you don't want to give them the keys to the car and just have them drive, right? So one of the things that we can also do is make sure when an LLM hallucinates to actually catch that and remediate that, right? And then finally, smoothing and formatting cleanup, making sure that the tags are all aligned and in the proper place, right? So when there's no human in the loop, all of this gets done and is as fully automated as possible because that gives us the best quality translation.
Great. Yeah, I think what I'm getting from this is that AI and even changes in MT have greatly expanded the ways that we can kind of pick and choose and connect together all these different types of workflows. And I know from looking at our platform, to your point, Alex, one customer can have 25, 30 different workflows for all the different content. So it's not even just even a choice between those three buckets, but how does that look for each individual customer and content type? Speaking of all the options out there, I think we did some research recently at the end of last year around the changing translation mix. So Ryan, can you talk to us a little bit about, and I already feel like I know the answer to this question, but what the ideal translation mix looks like, or maybe just what typically customers are using today?
Yeah, what the ideal translation mix looks like. I wish I was able to say that. There is an answer. Unfortunately, if you joined this webinar to get that answer, there is no perfect answer. It is unique to every single organization. Like I said earlier, it is unique to each product line, each content type. Even within that content type, there are various translation mixes that are better for some organizations that might not work for other organizations. Now, what you have pulled up here is the changing in translation mix that we've seen over time. So what you see on the left is 2021. Earlier, I referenced 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 8 years ago. I didn't make that up, right? Like I am talking about actual data that we see inside of the platform. On the left, you're seeing less than a third of all content going through an MT or AI involved workflow, where on the right, we're seeing almost 65% of content be touched by MT or AI in some way. That is a dramatic shift. Now, I think we're going to later on get into, if you're AI curious, if you will, how to get started, how to track against it. So I'm excited to get into that. But since I gave a non-answer here, let me see if Alex has a better answer than me.
Yeah, I wish I could also, foretell the future. I have some thoughts about it that I'll share. Before I do so, I just wanted to share one interesting anecdote that I think points at why we're seeing this transition into more machine translation and into more machine translation and post editing. And frankly, I think it has to do with the fact that machine translation quality is getting more reliable, it's getting better as we head into large language models, right? So one of the things that we were doing actually recently, this was a couple of days ago on our whole team, is we purposely try to break Google Translate. What I mean by that is we wanted to come up with sentences that would make Google Translate give an absolutely ridiculous, nonsensical, completely illogical mistranslation. And the truth is that we couldn't, right? And to me, that's kind of evidence of how good these things, these these MT providers and large language models are getting. So we ultimately had to resort to things like, okay, we can't break it and have it do something silly by just putting in regular text. Let's start resorting to like idioms and colloquialisms and slangs. And even then, for a good part, it did a pretty decent job at picking up like proverbs and slang and idioms, right? Some it didn't, but like that tended to be kind of the breaking point, right? Which to me was a sign of the fact that a lot of the content that you throw at it, it does a fairly decent job, right? And that kind of gets into, my crystal ball prediction. I basically see this trend of more and more content going to machine translation and post editing continuing, right? As I was saying, with this anecdote, I think we see an inflection point where neural machine translation is being replaced by large language models. I think if we were talking this time next year, I think we'd see pretty much everything or close to everything going to large language models that are fine-tuned. So they're getting better at initial translation quality. They're also getting better at post-editing themselves, right? Using one model to post-edit what another model gives us. And they're even getting better at providing signals to us when they hallucinate and do something silly, right? And what I mean by that is you can actually get information from some large language models that'll tell you what's the probability that I gave you this word or this phrase, right? And then you could begin to see how confident they were in the translation, right? So I think what we're going to see in the next few years is there's going to be less pure human translation. We're going to see more content going to post editing, more content going to even pure machine translation without a human in the loop. But I think what will happen is that linguists will become more prized as analysts who can collaborate with data scientists, with computational linguists to identify and fix linguistic patterns that make LLMs create undesired translations and basically correct these behaviors. So Ryan, if I can step in for a second and ask you what you think about this idea of linguists as co-pilots.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think my team and your team need to have a meeting, and your team can just present the slang inputs that you put into Google Translate. I'm so curious about that. But yeah, asking about the Copilot, I've said this on previous webinars. I say this to customers every day. I talk about it with my team. We talk about it in internal meetings. I don't think linguists are going anywhere. Professional translators, professional editors, that expertise is invaluable. As you phrased it, what we're going to see are co-pilots, right? And what we're seeing is an increase in content being authorized and or requested for translation. Sorry, sometimes I use Smartling lingo naturally. So we see more and more content being authorized, and that's what this is allowing for. If you can't tell, I like using metaphors. Unfortunately, I do have to credit our CEO, Brian Murphy, with this. I promised I'd give him a shout out, but we were talking the other day, and he likens the decrease in cost for translation and the ability to provide more output to something like a Spotify or a Netflix, where back in the day, I might be aging myself for any Gen Zers that are listening here, but we used to have to go to the store and buy DVDs or VHS, and they would be $15 a pop, $20 a pop, right? Where now I pay, well, Netflix probably isn't a great example at the moment, but I pay Spotify, I believe, $12 a month or $10 a month, something like that. And I have every single album that I used to go to Sam Goody and look for in my pocket, right on my device, right? And that has allowed me to consume so much music and so many podcasts and so many audiobooks. I see the same thing for localization, where we're going to have translators working on that content that is front and center and use their expertise. But the involvement in AI and MT is going to unlock the ability to translate this content that is currently sitting there untranslated or unexposed to localization. So not sure if that answered your question directly, Alex, but those are sort of my thoughts on what MT and the adoption of LLMs are unlocking, not just for our customers, but really for humans in the world. right? So that's kind of a tangent, but hopefully somebody enjoyed it.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think that element of volume is super important for this conversation as well, because obviously looking at this translation mix, we don't have the context of volume, but we are seeing that that's grown over time exponentially in the past 3 years as well. So moving on a little bit to what do you do if you're translating a new type of content, a new project, or maybe just starting out with translation? How do we advise companies, Alex, on this decision? And I'll pull up a maybe helpful visual for that as well.
Yeah, so basically the idea of this visual is to give some guidance as to what type of content can be used for. You can see on the right-hand side, transcreation, which would be pretty much complete human, really very little automation, as I described earlier. On the left-hand side, machine translation, right? Pure machine translation, no human being in the loop, right? You could see things, for example, like support tickets, like knowledge bases, like forums, right? Things that just need to be actionable, right? And then you have, for example, in the middle, AI translation, which for us is something where by using all of these various large language model hooks that I spoke of before, where we feel like we're getting quality that's essentially as good as machine translation post editing, right? Which leaves the human powered translation, right? That middle column for things like marketing, regulated industries, right? Application content, right? I think Ryan can expand a bit more on that. One, I wanted to mention a couple of ideas that kind of when I was thinking of when I have new content, what content fits into what bucket, I'd maybe consider some of the metrics that marketers use, right? So things like content ROI, right? So I have content. What is the revenue generated from this content for my company relative to the cost of creating and distributing it, right? Some other metrics that you can consider are things like engagement metrics, right? If I have a particular web page, how much time do people spend on it, right? How many times do they share it? How many times do they like it? Their comment on it, right? And that might give me an idea as to whether I should do this perhaps with no human in the loop. And then if I see lots of people engaging with it, then maybe I promote it to AI with a human in the loop, right? And maybe things, for example, like bounce rate, the percentage of visitors that go to a page or a site and leave after only one page, right? These are just kind of some examples that I think you can use to try to gauge how important your content is. Ryan, what do you think? Because you actually consult customers quite a bit on this.
Yeah, I have an easy answer here. Talk to your CSM, right? So that is a little bit of a sassy answer for me, but realistically, in my opinion, the best way to learn a new method or dip your toes into something that you're not familiar with is by learning from others. And CSMs at Smartling work with clients of all shapes and sizes. And we have a lot of customer stories and a lot of experience with what happens when you pull a certain lever. And I think what CSMs are trying to do every single day when talking to customers about these sort of things is guide you in the right direction. Great results for our customers means great results for Smartling. So I'm going back to my non-answer here. I'm sorry, Cassie, but what we're displaying on the screen and these examples of documentation for AIT or regulated industry for AIHT, that is not necessarily lockstep, right? That is not necessarily, hey, one-to-one match no matter what. So for each content type, each page, each release, what you want to do is have a targeted approach. And when you're working with Smartling, you can rely on your CSM either to provide guidance themselves or loop in experts like Alex about what might be the best solution for you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that even if you don't work with Smartling, that element of like learning from others is so important. And I know with AI, and it's still a relatively new technology, hearing what other people are doing, I know many conferences in this space have features of people who are utilizing these new technologies. And so I think that is super helpful and important. I am going to go off script, guys. I'm gonna give you a Q&A question because I think it's maybe helpful to understand some of these. Daniel asked, what about MT plus AI plus human? So I wanted you guys to comment on that because I think when we see stuff like AI translation and AIHT, it's easy to assume we're just talking about LLMs. But maybe Alex, you can kind of touch on how MT is playing a role even in these AI powered options.
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about this hybrid MT AI plus human, at least the way we're using it is we basically look at your content when it first comes in, and we look at your translation memory, and we use a large language model to see if we can further improve it, right? If it's a completely new sentence or it's below a certain threshold, then it goes to machine translation, right? And ideally, it would go to a machine translation. We have auto select, which is the best of the generic engines, but we also have the ability to train machine translation engines, and those tend to be even better than generic engines, right? So at that point, it would go to a machine translation engine that ideally is trained, and then the AI part comes in again to do things like glossary insertion, to inject formality, and to do any sort of formatting and post-processing, right? And after all of that, well, actually, there's one more piece, and where we actually try to estimate the effort required by a human being to actually edit the string, right? And then it would go to a human being with this nomenclature that says, hey, we think that this is the equivalent of a green light. You probably don't need to look at it very much, versus, hey, this might be a level 3 and it's probably has, may have like a major error that you need to correct with something like level 2, a yellow light in between, right? So that's kind of what allows humans to be very, very efficient in what they're doing. And it's kind of this hybrid MT plus AI plus human workflow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry if you don't mind me jumping in there. My favorite example to share of MT and AI working together is we work with a government office, and the head of the government office is female, right? And as we all know, in many, many languages, the A or O at the end of the noun defines whether something is masculine or feminine. Um, for some reason, MT output assumes the gender is male for these government positions. So we actually combine the MT output and then insert post processing via AI to correct that and make that government official's title female. I think it's a really cool use of MT and AI working together. And then we're able to send that to a human post editor as well. Obviously, that's high visibility, critical content, seeing that it's from a government office. So just a cool use case of everything working together that I always like to show off.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think the main point here is I think a lot of these sort of new hybrid approaches do incorporate MT and AI together. I think, we've talked about this and probably could go on for a long time, Alex, but MT engines are still really good at this like raw translation element of things. And so layering on LLMs as a pre and post processing step is the way that you can get the most ROI from these tools. And so you're automatically oftentimes using MT, AI, and human in these new hybrid workflows. So thank you for the question, and thanks, guys, for letting me spring that on you outside of the Q&A section. But we'll get back to our regularly scheduled content now. So I think one other element we talked about, what would you do if you're just starting out translating? But Ryan, if you're already translating, how do you tell if your mix is actually working or not for you? So how do you help customers understand whether something is working or whether it's not working for them?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this goes back to a lot of what Alex and I have been saying during this chat, which is whether you're focusing on getting better turnaround time, so speed, increasing quality, or defining a level of quality performance that is the right quality for your content. And then how many dollars are you saving? So the most important thing is that a goal is set. And I like to set goals that are quantifiable. I work in a people-facing position, but my brain works in a very numbers-driven way. So I like to see a target. I like to see the savings that we would like to introduce. I would like to see the words per day that we would like to increase our throughput by. Things along those lines that you should define internally to be able to measure the success of your translation mix, then also tying that to localization goals, your localization department goals. So I'm going to do a little plug for Cassie here. We did a webinar 2 months ago or a few months ago that was around communicating the ROI of your localization department internally. That was with Kevin O'Donnell. He's the CEO of a localization consulting firm called Global 10X. There are a lot of good insights in that 30-minute webinar around communicating your value internally. I think it speaks to this answer a lot. So if you don't mind checking that out, it's available on our marketing page. One last thing I'll say is around defining goals. We work with a customer who I'm not able to name, but they're a large customer of ours that we love working with. And a couple of years ago, they only did translation and editing. So it was 100% human translation. And I have the numbers written down. I don't want to misquote them. So forgive me for reading here. Starting in Q2 of 24, they ramped up to 43% AI human translation. So that's the human in the loop workflow where it goes through AI first, and then they have a linguist step in after. The results were so strong that they actually boosted that number up to 71% in Q3. So they went from 100% of content going through a full human workflow to 71% of content going through an AI HT workflow, and the remaining 29% going through that full human high touch workflow. And that is high visibility marketing content, things along those lines. But their goal was to increase turnaround time and save money, or speed up turnaround time and save money. So we calculated their savings in Q3 alone. This company saved $191,000, maintained the same level of quality, and doubled their word per day turnaround time. Actually, more than doubled their words per day throughput from about 2,000 words per day per language to about 5,000 words per day per language. So the proof is in the pudding, if you ask me. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but I think it's valuable to hear that example. Alex, anything to add there? Or where we
I'll
got
take it over to Alex. I just wanted to say, I think that's a good example of what we were talking about at the top. I just wanted to make sure that's clear. Like, this is the major lever that is available to pull when you want to make those changes. So, Alex, I'll kind of kick it over to you around. Ryan talked through this company incrementally adopting a new workflow. So, do we have recommendations for people out there who maybe aren't using these hybrid workflows or just want to figure out how to incrementally improve their mix this year?
Yeah, so kind of as Ryan was alluding, there are technologically there are a bunch of different levers that we can use to do more automation, right? So it could be something as simple as, let's start infusing machine translation where something was done completely by a human being before. Or if we already have machine translation, can we train a machine translation engine so it's even further down the line and gives more quality, right? Can we make use of translation memories with a large language model to improve their quality? To me, what's and I wanted kind of to second what Ryan said is, to me, what's really, really helpful is the full transparency that we have, right? So when we talk about numbers, it's not just a matter of just randomly pulling this lever and kind of crossing our fingers and hoping that it works. I think what's great is that we can see the benefit of every single lever that we use, right? So if we plug in a machine translation engine, we can actually see how much more productive a linguist is in that language versus another language, right? So we have reports in the system to do that. We can actually take a look at somebody's productivity and see how frequently they're visiting a segment and how much cognitive load there is, right? We can also see, for example, if we improve a fuzzy match, by what percentage on average we do, right? So I think all of that kind of bubbles up to what Ryan was talking about, like all of these various numbers bubble up into a big number of, hey, we're doing more words per day, and as a client, you're saving significantly more.
Yeah, I think the tracking element is super important, like you said, Alex, and making sure that when you make these changes, you understand maybe what caused these improvements, or how you can handle any negative things that might happen as well. So I know kind of, do you have any strategies or tips this year that you'd recommend to people for incremental improvement? I know we've talked in the past at past webinars about training engines versus using generic. Any other kind of tidbits like that, Alex, that you want to share?
So I would say probably training engines that would produce a better quality, and really making use of large language models for, if you have a robust translation memory that you're writing in such a way that reuses that translation memory, then we could use large language models on top of that. Also, some of the post-processing things that Ryan was alluding to, right? We can do things like infuse formality, right? If for, depending on what the content is, if it needs to be more formal versus less formal, right? And depending on what the client and the persona is, injecting the glossary, doing this sort of gender debiasing that Ryan was talking about, essentially having LLMs become much more a part of your workflow.
Yeah, to add on to that, and I see an earlier question in the chat around, hey, can we write custom prompts, things along those lines. I think the cool thing is that we're at a point where we're sort of creating where this is going, right? So if there's something that you want to do with LLMs, if there's something you want to see from AI, ask, and we could talk about it, and we can try to figure out a way to get the results that you want. If we understand what your goals are, we'll try to work together to get you where you need to be. And part of that is maybe, as Cassie said, hey, if we need to course correct, we're going to have a plan of action there. If we feel that you're going for AI and we think it needs that human touch, we'll communicate that to you. So working together, collaborating, and finding the best translation mix for you. It's not an exact science, but we need to work together. We need to iterate, and we need to understand what our goals are.
Maybe if I could also add to that, like I know you had, this was kind of like a 3-part question in the chat, right? Like, so as far as AI being integrated into the system, a lot of the large language model that I described that are doing things like fuzzy match repair, that are doing glossary term insertion, gender debiasing, etc. We actually have integrations for Google Gemini, for IBM Watson X, for OpenAI directly with OpenAI and on Azure, and for Amazon Bedrock as well. As far as writing custom prompts, yes, we have an integration for GPT, again, either directly on OpenAI or Azure, where we have a little sandbox actually as part of our integration where you could write the prompt and you could try to see how it works. With the quality of LLM translations, I would say right now, so one of the metrics that we use to measure is MQM. It's a multi-quality dimensional framework. It's on a scale from 0 to 100. Basically, when we have a human involved, we're at 98, which is, essentially what is used in the industry when a human being is involved. When we have basically all of these various hooks that I described in AIT, we're at 95 without a human in the loop, which is very, very good. And can you rely solely on AI workflows for localization? I would say, kind of going back to the translation mix, yes, but it depends on what the content is, right? If it's high-end marketing, I wouldn't, because you still want a person to look at it so you don't have something silly come up. But if it's something like a knowledge base or forum, yeah, you could. But I would also I'd also be open with your users and put a disclaimer and say this was done by machine translation or machine translation with LLMs, just so kind of people understand.
Great, thank you. You're stealing my Q&A responsibilities there, Alex. No, I'm kidding. All right, last question I think that I just wanted to pose to you both was, you already gave a lot of great examples of our customers and what they're doing, but I'm curious if you have any interesting approaches to translation mix that you've seen over the past year that you think would be worth sharing with our audience. So Ryan, maybe I'll pass that to you to start.
Yeah, I think I get really excited and just start talking. So I've shared a couple examples already, whether it be that that government department that we work with, the company that has been adopting AI HT over the past 12 months. I think one more approach that I've seen pop up from customers is that a couple answers ago, Alex plugged training machine translation engines and getting started that way. If you have a robust, the ending popped up, it threw me off there. If you have a robust TM, high quality TM, you can train engines to improve their quality. And I see a lot of customers using or wanting to use and using a trained MT with a post edit human in the loop applied to it. So that is getting really high quality, the 98 type of MQM that Alex was referencing. But I think it's a great use of almost strapping a jetpack to our translators and letting them take off and accelerate, get them at a starting point that's elevated as opposed to the raw source content, and then improving turnaround times, reducing cost, improving quality, all those great things that we love talking about. So that's my non-specific example. And Alex, you got anything?
Yeah, I have a similar example. So I wanted to kind of use your metaphor of a jetpack, right? And the fact that like when you have a trained machine translation engine, it does better than a generic engine. We've seen something similar like that we've done for edit effort estimation, right? And so the idea here is, right, we've done our machine translation, we put in all our bells and whistles, we made it as good as we can, but can we tell the linguist how good it is, right? And we have generic models that perform very, very well. And we found that when we actually customize, when we fine tune those edit effort estimation models, we could be even more hyper focused in giving a more accurate prediction. And where that ultimately gets into dollars and cents is if we can accurately tell you that something is a level 1, meaning that it's very, very good, you can pay for it far less, or with a dynamic workflow, you can skip it altogether and go directly to publishing, right? So if we've told you more accurately that now instead of 5 segments, 10 segments are really, really good, then that's obviously more money that you're saving. By the same token, if now we've got this hyper-focused model and it can tell you, hey, it used to be a major error, but we actually think that in your case, for your style, it's only a minor error. Again, that's less money that you're paying a linguist, and therefore the work can be done more quickly.
Yeah, I think those dynamic workflows are a pretty interesting application as well, in addition to the trained MT, especially when paired or you're using AIHT outputs in order to do that training and make sure that it's really high quality data we're using there. So we answered our Q&A during the session this time, so that was fun. Thank you, Ryan and Alex, so much for being here and sharing all of your examples and tips and tricks. So I'm sure the audience appreciated that as well. So thanks so much.
Yeah,
And
thanks for having us.
yeah,
Yes, thank you very much.
We do have our next session coming up on quality programs. So if you are interested in learning more about setting up a LQA program or maybe finding out if it's working for you, come next week on Wednesday. The registration link is in the chat currently. And then we also just announced our date for Global Ready Conference, which is coming up on the 30th of April remotely. So get signed up for that early, and we will have amazing speakers like Ryan and Alex on that session in April. So thanks so much for coming, and I hope you guys all have a great week.